Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Gathering Data about Indigenous Gender and Identity, What is Missing from the Numbers. I'm Cynthia Holt, the Executive Director, and before I turn things over to Julie to introduce our speaker today, just a few housekeeping things. The first is that we are recording the whole webinar, and it will be available on the CAAL website shortly after the webinar ends. I'll be sending an email out to everybody who registered for the session to let you know that when the recording is up. Also, if you are for the session, if you could please mute your mic and turn off your camera just to save bandwidth because we have some folks coming in from low bandwidth areas. But we will have Q&A at the end, and if you want to ask your question out loud, please feel free to turn on your camera and unmute yourself to ask the question out loud. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Julie Marcoux, who is the data librarian at Dalhousie University. Julie.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm serving as moderator today. Excuse my voice. I'd like to start by acknowledging that CAAL-CBPA represents member libraries across the region, all of whom sit on the unceded and traditional territories of First Peoples. In Newfoundland and Labrador, our libraries sit on the homelands of the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukawoot, the Innu of Nitassinan, the Beothuk, and the Mi'kmaq people. In Prince Edward Island in Nova Scotia, we find our friends and colleagues situated on the territory of the Mi'kmaq. In New Brunswick, libraries are found on the land of the Waylasquik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy people. CAAL-CBPA wish to express their sincere gratitude to the First Peoples who share their ancestral homelands with us all. And now, to introduce Margaret Robinson. Margaret is a Mi'kmaq scholar and a member of Lennox Island First Nation. She grew up in Sheet Harbor in the Esquikawake district of Mi'kma'ki. She's been a community-based researcher for over 15 years and has led a lot of studies, including a study on decolonizing research funding in Canada. She identifies as two-spirit, bisexual, and queer, conducts research with sexual and gender minority people, and holds the Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Reconciliation, Gender, and Identity. Margaret works as an associate professor at Dalhousie University in her traditional territory of Mi'kma'ki. And I've had a kind of a preview of this talk, and you should all be very excited. It's going to be wonderful. I'll let you take over, Margaret.
Oh, walalan. Hello, Gwen in Dalhousie, Margaret Robinson. Lewat Eskigawage, Wigi Sesakuk. Hi, I'm Margaret Robinson. I work at Dalhousie as a two-spirit researcher. I hold the Canada Research Chair in Reconciliation, Gender, and Identity. And most of the work that I do as part of that looks at how identity and culture keep people well. So today I'll talk about colonialism and studies that aim to recruit two-spirit people. And I'll talk about some issues of data collection, including settler imposture, that is, people who are reporting themselves or pretending to be Indigenous when in fact they are not. And then finally, I'll make some suggestions for how we might change data collection to make it more useful. I'll start by talking about two-spirit identity. This was a term coined in 1990 by Indigenous sexual and gender minority people themselves. And it replaces an earlier label, berdache, which anthropologists use to describe gender roles in Indigenous nations. And there were many of these. So for instance, the Lakota, sometimes called the Dakota or the Sioux, used the term winkte to describe people who did gender differently. The Ashwi, sometimes called the Zuni, had a gender of people called the Lamana. And the Dine or the Navajo Nation used the term nadle, meaning one who was in a constant state of change, to refer to people who had changed their gender in some way. When anthropologists, settler anthropologists that is, first wrote about these genders, they did so with a single cultural or regional context. So they would focus on the Navajo, or they would focus on the Ashwi. However, with industrialization in the 1920s, settler scholars shifted from viewing Indigenous nations as distinct political bodies to viewing every Indigenous group as part of a larger category of the American Indian. And so we see this in two-spirit research as well. So by the 1950s, we see berdache being used to describe roles across Indigenous nations, whereas before it had been just focused on, here is a manifestation of a different gender within a particular culture. Now suddenly they're using berdache to describe more than one Indigenous role in more than one Indigenous culture. So a note on berdache published in 1955 refers to the North American berdache, as if this role is similar right across the continent rather. So they're kind of amalgamating and lumping together all of these different gender expressions that were distinct to specific cultures into one different type of category, an anthropological category that's really about doing gender differently. And although we don't use Berdache today, researchers often make the same assumption that all Indigenous people who express gender differently are similar, and so we can group them all together. So we regularly, for instance, use Two-Spirit to describe all the Indigenous participants who report a minority sexual or gender identity. And I know I've done this many times myself. From a settler perspective, Two-Spirit might seem very much like a sexual identity similar to queer, bisexual, lesbian, or gay, or it might seem like a gender identity, like non-binary or trans. However, let's take settlers out of the picture for a moment. Let's not think about those frameworks, and let's only consider Indigenous nations. Two-Spirit has similarities to two other roles I've encountered, both of which are spiritual. And spirituality isn't often considered in a sexual health framework, but for Indigenous people, spirituality is a significant social determinant of health. One of these roles, I'll note, is the hioka, sometimes translated as the contrary or the sacred clown. Academic sources associate the hioka with the Lakota and the Dakota people of the plains, but the first contrary I met was Elder Vern Harper, who led the Toronto branch of the American Indian movement. I met Elder Harper through his work with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, where I did 2 of my postdocs, and one of those was about the Two-Spirit mental health. And so I was asking Elder Harper about this, and he said, well, I'm not Two-Spirit, but I'm a contrary, which is a bit similar. And the contrary does things backwards or unconventionally, challenging social norms and boundaries. And so I can see a similarity in this critiquing role that reminds me a bit of the settler concept of queer. But yet the contrary role might include sexuality or gender. It's not a sexual or gender role by itself. It's about balancing opposites and challenging the conventional. So it's not quite the same as queer. Unlike Two-Spirit, which describes roles for individuals, some sources report that the hioka were part of societies that incorporated contrariness into dances or rituals. So there's a social element there that is present today with Two-Spirit people who have societies and associations, but wasn't necessarily present in the original manifestation of gender difference within a particular nation. And so then there's a second role that I think is similar in some ways that we might think about, which is persons identified as carrying spiritual power. In Mi'kmaq culture, the buowan is often described as healing the sick or solving problems. And we see this use in the Native Women's Association of Canada documents, which associate the buowan with Two-Spirit and trans being. The common element I see between buowan and Two-Spirit is about boundary shifting. The late Mi'kmaq elder, Dr. Daniel Paul, wrote a book with Dr. Raniel Bowers, where they explained that there's a poetry in the Buowanak tradition that is often referred to as shape-shifting, being with male or female, appearing as male or female. And so they're using this idea of moving across boundaries in a similar way, and they're framing it as related in some ways to Two-Spirit identity. So I think this could be really productive to take a look at. Pressure often to make our work relevant to a settler audience means that quantitative data about contraries or buowan or other spiritual roles is almost non-existent. So I'll start by flagging that we rarely look at the categories that exist in our own traditions. We're usually looking at categories that come to us from settler research. A recurring theme in the Indigenous scholarship and historical documents with which I grapple as a Two-Spirit scholar is the relevance or irrelevance of sexual identity. What do I mean by that? Well, there are over 500 Indigenous nations in North America, so that's a lot of variation. However, a pattern I've noticed is that sexuality did not seem to be a marker of identity, and gender was relevant in some places and then not relevant in others. So among the Mi'kmaq, for instance, sexuality and gender are not labeled as identities. So you can't say, what's the Mi'kmaq word for gay? It's not a simple translation. Instead, people were described based on their abilities, such as the buowan, or based on their behavior. So for example, Two-Spirit scholar John R. Silaboy is Mi'kmaq and has considered the phrase Ginumu Gisalagi, which some have listed as a Two-Spirit identity. Silaboy translates the phrase as one loves men. But, Syllaboy notes, the phrase doesn't specify the gender of the person doing the loving, so we don't know who this person might be, and it lacks a sexual implication. So Syllaboy concludes that it's not equivalent to a sexual identity. Another way that sexuality might not be relevant to Indigenous people relates, I think, to a tendency not to categorize. This slide shows findings from a 1998 study by Dr. Elizabeth Saywick and colleagues. And they found that 28.7% of Indigenous youth in the US in their study were not sure what their sexual orientation was, compared to only 12% of Anglo-American youth. Saywick and colleagues also received high rates of non-response from Indigenous youth when they asked about attraction or fantasy. 1998 was a long time ago now, but I'd love to see this recreated in a contemporary data set to see if the numbers remain similar, but to my knowledge, this has not yet been done. Saywick and colleagues theorize that the youth in their study might have been hesitant to reply to their questions because of cultural taboos against sexuality, or that tribal norms might reflect a different construction of sexual identities. That is, behavior might have different meanings in their context. That made some of these questions confusing as a result. Personally, I've seen plenty of instances where sexual difference is recognized by Indigenous community members, but it's not always framed as particularly salient. If we're going to center the data interests and the needs of Indigenous communities, we need to reconsider the way that we collect data and whether or not that data will be useful to those communities. Indigenous scholars Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson note the limitations in Indigenous research also include a lack of tribally specific data, a lack of representative data, a lack of statistical power to conduct sophisticated analyses. And all of these are true for Two-Spirit research in particular, but also for Indigenous research more broadly. In their book, Indigenous Statistics, Walter and Anderson outline how colonial population management has driven data collection. It determines what questions we ask, and then it determines what we do with that data. As a result, surveys rarely reflect Indigenous community interests or our worldviews. So, for example, we often ask if people are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, and we might ask if they're status or non-status. But we rarely ask about other categories that might be more significant for Indigenous peoples in our nations. So we don't usually ask about nation or tribe. So for instance, Mi'kmaq. We rarely ask about communities that they might have come from. So Lennox Island, for instance, in the case of my family. We rarely ask what territory they're living in. It's usually organized by province or postal code. We almost never ask about the confederacy to which they might belong, such as the Wabanaki in our case here in the East. We rarely ever ask about their clan, societies they might belong to, or their family names. All of these would be ways that people might organize data if we were just doing it for ourselves in an Indigenous context. Here's some questions from the Indigenous People Survey of 2022 conducted by StatsCan. I identify as Mi'kmaq, but it's not an option, so I would select First Nations. Someone else with my same history, so Mi'kmaq and Scottish ancestry, growing up without status, living off reserve, someone like that might select Métis, indicating that their ancestry is mixed. This conflicts with the understanding of Métis held by the Métis National Council, but it's how many people might have responded to this survey in the East. However, as with many national databases, when we analyze data, we tend to lump all the Métis reporting people together, as if what they've reported is exactly the same regardless of where they live or what that term meant for them. But how we identify, what we think it means, and who gets to choose which options are legitimate is a serious issue. We're not just reporting reality when we do research. We're shaping it by deciding which values and identities to reinforce. The questions that we ask in these surveys would not produce data about my own nation, because my belonging to the Mi'kmaq Nation is irrelevant to the aim of this study, which is colonial management of populations based on their history of relations with the federal government. So in a community-based study, these might not be the terms we would use at all, but there'd be pressure to do so to relate it to other research coming from other places. So let's think of a question like, how many Two-Spirit people live in Mi'kmaq? I would love to know this. In an ideal world, it would be an easy question to answer, but colonialism makes it difficult. Large studies generally don't consider territories, so we can't just switch to organizing the data by territory because it's not set up that way. We could gather data from federally mandated reserves. That would get us a lot of people who are Indigenous. Except settlers also live there, particularly those who married into the community. So living in a reserve space doesn't necessarily mean that that person is going to be Indigenous. We could survey people who hold federally issued Indian status, except some settler women received Indian status by marrying status men. This ended in 1985 with the passing of Bill C-31, but women aged 57 or older today with Indian status may not have Indigenous ancestry if the status came through marriage. Maybe, I thought, we could survey enrolled members of Indigenous nations. A lot of people have taken the citizenship approach lately, except many Indigenous people, usually women, aren't eligible for membership. The sexism encoded into the Indian Act stripped generations of Indigenous women of federal and community recognition. These women were forced off the lands reserved for them, and they and their children became what we sometimes call non-status Indians. In addition, First Nations are significantly underfunded, and so some communities have closed their rolls to new members to conserve funds, leaving some Indigenous people without a home community at all. The federal government created similar situations by assigning some people general Indian status with no band membership attached to it. And so not having status or having status doesn't necessarily tell us whether they belong to an Indigenous community. And then there are people with Indigenous ancestry. Sometimes people call this tribal identity. But more people would identify themselves as Mi'kmaq than could establish Mi'kmaq citizenship. Some Mi'kmaq might not accept them as community members. However, our treaties don't distinguish. Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1752, for example, applies to the settler government, to the Indigenous people who signed it, and in the words of the treaty, their said tribe and their heirs and the heirs of their heirs forever. So we don't have anything in the treaties about blood quantum or identity or self-identity or status administered by the government. It's just about heirs. Moreover, not everyone with recent ancestry makes it a salient part of their identity. So for instance, many Black Nova Scotians have recent Mi'kmaq ancestry, but their Blackness shapes their life so much that also being Mi'kmaq may not be particularly significant for them. People are less likely to identify with their Indigenous nation if they were scooped or assimilated. So we have a diaspora of Indigenous people who identify as settlers or who may know that they're Indigenous, but that knowledge holds no meaning for them. Additionally, even Indigenous borders change over time. So for instance, Newfoundland is often counted as part of Mi'kmaq now, but it wasn't always. So where do I count Mi'kmaq as occurring in order to count the Two-Spirit people within it? It's a tricky question. Maybe, I thought, if I cobbled together some postal codes, I could approximate Mi'kmaq, but maybe not. This is the area of Mi'kmaq in which I was raised. It's called Wedgwood, referring to the bubbling waters that occur in one of the rivers on the west. It's in the district of Escagawage, or maybe it's the district of Sibaganaggity. The districts differ from one map to another, and so those lines may have been drawn differently at different times, depending on when the maps were made. But the postal code for this region is BOJ3BO. However, it covers 5,500 kilometers. That area contains Reserve 36, which is outlined here in red, and is administered by Millbrook First Nation, about an hour's drive away. To complicate matters further, not all of the Mi'kmaq who live in this area are eligible to live on reserve land. So growing up, I lived 8 minutes away, but we would frequently come to the reserve to visit friends. And the situation changes over time. So I wasn't eligible to live on a reserve growing up, but I would be eligible to live there today. Not everyone with Mi'kmaq ancestry in the area identifies publicly as Mi'kmaq. And despite the reserve, the community was very much a white settler village. So perhaps postal codes could work on a large scale, but they're too broad to produce accurate local data. And they can't distinguish Indigenous communities from settler communities. So my question, how many Two-Spirit people are there in Mi'kmaq, remains unanswered, in part because the way we collect and hold data isn't designed for questions like this. How we understand two-spirit health is also shaped by who defines health. These are questions from the Young Mania Rating Scale. It was developed by Dr. Vincent Ziegler in 1978, and it's still used often to assess bipolar disorder. But as you look at the screen, you can see terms in the measure include inappropriate or questionable, and these highlight the degree to which social norms and the violation of social norms are a key interest in the diagnosis. So I wonder how someone using this form might perceive a hioka or a contrary. Note also the measure's reference to being overdressed, poorly groomed, or bizarre. This seems deeply rooted in settler culture and class standards. And so I fear what they might make of traditional regalia, let alone contemporary styles, which can sometimes sort of bring the razzle-dazzle to the show. And so these measures, which present as if they're just about health, are really also about culture and about how closely we represent and replicate settler culture. You can also see how cosmology comes into play and the reference to grandiose ideas or delusions, which assumes an agreed upon nature of reality from which a patient might deviate. For mental health measures to reflect an Indigenous worldview or to consider the cultural norms of a specific Indigenous nation would be great, but few of them do this. Even in a project led by Indigenous people, we might feel pressure to use measures that are going to define some of us as mentally ill or at best wrongly socialized. So we need to think carefully about the measures we use. There's been a lot of news about people who represented themselves as Indigenous, but were not. This is not a new phenomenon. However, there are important changes going on in how people identify, and we can see this in surveys. According to the 2016 survey, 1.4 million people in Canada have Indigenous ancestry, or believe they do enough to report it on a government survey. Some of those people are correct. Lots of folks have Indigenous ancestors. Some of them are honestly mistaken. Family stories aren't always accurate. Just because a relative was called Mohawk Bob doesn't mean he was Ganagahaga. Even historical records are often misleading, easily misinterpreted, or incorrect. My parents once put our cat Buffy on the Canadian census. At the time, I thought it was hilarious, but since talking to people who do research with this data set, I realized it could cause a lot of problems, including making it look like we had a child who disappeared in our family. However, it did let me know that not every data set can be relied upon. And not everyone who claims to be Indigenous can be relied upon. Some of them are lying. We need concrete strategies to preserve our confidence in Indigenous data. There's so little of it, and what we do have there often drives policy. So accuracy is essential. So what does big data tell us about what's going on with indigeneity? StatsCan reports that 25.5% of those who identified as Aboriginal in 2011 had identified as non-Aboriginal in a previous survey. So that's a lot of people. And it's a bit suspicious to see a movement that large. What's with that 25%? Well, change doesn't necessarily mean dishonesty. Genealogical research is more accessible now. Some people are influenced by DNA reports that suggest that they have DNA from particular regions or particular social groups. And in addition, the stigma of being Indigenous has been reduced, meaning that more people are willing to embrace that aspect of themselves. Successfully recruiting Two-Spirit people requires that we consider who we count as an Indigenous participant. It also means we need to think carefully about why we're asking. So are we assuming that indigeneity is the same right across vast regions? Are we assuming that everyone who says they're Indigenous on a survey will fit particular outcomes in terms of health? If we haven't thought about what we're going to do with that information, maybe we're not ready yet to be asking the questions. If I'm using a social determinants of health framework, then maybe I need to think about Two-Spirit as a social outcome. So maybe I'm interested in people who live in Indigenous communities or in how living away from their community might affect their well-being and access to social support. Great. But then we come to the question of what counts as an Indigenous community. Areas where some Indigenous people were forced to live by the colonial government were once called reserves. Today, many people use the term Indigenous community to reflect that those communities are self-sustaining, are self-directing, and are no longer the kinds of images that we are used to having from what some people have called poverty porn, even though many of them are still seriously underfunded. But not every community is a former reserve. My grandmother moved to Jabuktuk, which is Halifax, as a young woman, and there have been 5 generations of Robinsons living there since. Is Halifax an Indigenous community? If yes, who leads its government? There is none. There's no Indigenous government for Halifax. From whom then would I seek permission to conduct research there? Say, even to confirm my own family's belonging to that Indigenous community, if there is one. We often default to a local friendship center or a Native women's organization, but that's not the same as having an elective chief and council to whom I can go if a problem arises. A common solution to identity questions has been to ask not who do you claim, but who claims you? To what communities do you belong? If we pursue this line, are we going to exclude Indigenous people who live apart from others? Do the antisocial have identities? The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples doesn't suggest that being outside of your group, being rejected even, removes your indigeneity, but we often behave as if it does in research. If I'm asking who claims you, am I asking about social acceptance as part of the group or about political citizenship? Because these are distinct. Some people are accepted as Mi'kmaq socially and culturally, including people who are adopted or marry in, especially if they speak the language. But not everyone who's accepted as part of the social group will have Indian status or band membership or paperwork to show that. And not everyone with paperwork is considered part of the cultural group. So there's a term, paper Indians, to refer to people who have the documentation, but don't belong to any Indigenous group or have a cultural identity attached to it. Community belonging as a criterion raises the question of which communities we consider legitimate and which we do not. A number of organizations claiming to be Métis have emerged recently, and some appear to be strategies used by settlers to access Indigenous treaty rights. But this isn't the case for every Métis organization. And because of government regulations leading up to the repatriation of the Constitution, a number of organizations formed and used the term Métis in their identity, in their titles in the 1970s. And so there's a difference in many cases between an organization that used the term Métis in the 1970s and one using it today, because the context for that term changes over time. In addition, to even make it more complicated, not every group recognized by the Canadian federal government not every group not recognized by the Canadian federal government is illegitimate. So, for instance, in 1956, Canada declared the Sinix First Nation, a Salish people, to be extinct, leaving members in BC and the US without recognition under the Indian Act. After many years of dispute, the decision was reversed in 2021 by the Supreme Court. So the legitimacy of an Indigenous nation is not a decision that settler governments or researchers should be making, but it's usually the default that researchers end up going with is, do they have a relationship to the Canadian federal government? It should be an issue that Indigenous people are deciding for themselves. But of course, we don't always agree. My suggestion for researchers would be to be transparent about who we surveyed and where they reported belonging, and stop lumping everyone together as if all Indigenous identity, experience, and belonging are the same. As a researcher, it's important to report what measures I used and my reasons for choosing them. Show your work, as they say. So let the reader decide what to do with that information. Be aware of trauma. Indigenous peoples have been subjected to genocide multiple times. Asking for details about identity or community belonging can be re-traumatizing, and that can have serious health impacts. So, for example, the Honor Project, which was a study of Two-Spirit wellness led by Choctaw scholar Dr. Karina Walters, she found that Two-Spirit people who reflected on their historical loss more often had higher rates of smoking. This is terrible news. Like, as a researcher, I look at this and I say, okay, so what do I tell people? Like, don't think about historical loss because it might give you bad health outcomes. If my loss has included having my community declared illegitimate or my people extinct, then seemingly simple questions about my ancestry, my identity, or my citizenship could be very stressful, and it might worsen my health. So think about the workings of colonialism and settler privilege in our studies. Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson note that the Canadian census is unable to enumerate Aboriginal sociality, as they call it, because it fails to address three contexts. The first is tribal specificity. So I would call this Indigenous nationhood. I can't just get information about the Mi'kmaq, nor can government officials among the Mi'kmaq who might need that information to do their daily work. Second, it ignores the urban context where half of Indigenous people now live. And again, many of those people are without any kind of Indigenous government representation whatsoever, or have Indigenous government representation of a community from which they are diasporaed, or in some cases even seeking escape because of violence issues or other concerns. And so the third one is that Canadian census data misses the complexity of the Métis national contexts. And this is also a serious problem. How do we understand what people mean when they report Métis identity if we're not asking them or distinguishing whether they mean Western Métis or Eastern Métis, small m Métis, big M Métis? These are significant differences, particularly for Métis peoples. Walter and Anderson note that the categories in the census come from colonial policies over a century old, yet the census is one of the few sources for Indigenous data, and the categories do shape our policies. So there's this long-standing practice of treating the ways that settlers understand Indigenous peoples as natural, as if this is just the way our people should be understood. And I think that needs to change. Some suggest that the concept of indigeneity itself is colonial, since its only purpose is to distinguish citizens of Indigenous nations from the citizens of settler states on their territories. However, if we don't distinguish, I don't know how we would contextualize any of the data that we receive. I once did a Two-Spirit focus group, and none of the people who came for the focus group were Indigenous. They were all settlers wanting to learn more about Two-Spirit identity. I've got some recommendations for how we could collect Two-Spirit data in a way that might make it a little better for Indigenous communities and Indigenous scholars. I think we need to ask participants if they're Indigenous, but we also need to explain what that means. If the survey is going out to a general population, many newcomers to Canada and the US will not know what a term like Indigenous will mean. This can help separate out settlers who report a Two-Spirit identity. So if we asked, are you Indigenous? And then later on in the survey, we asked, are you Two-Spirit? We could separate people who hadn't reported an Indigenous identity from our Two-Spirit pool. Or we could consider asking about Two-Spirit identity in a sub-question that only appears if people report that they're Indigenous. I think we could allow Two-Spirit people to indicate what they mean by Two-Spirit identity in a survey. And I think this is important to do. Originally, it was an indicator of gender, and then the influence of settler identities like gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer has changed how many people conceive of Two-Spirit identity. So in the studies I did, half the participants described Two-Spirit as their gender, which would be traditional, and then half reported as their sexual identity, which is a different way of approaching it. And so we need to ask people, what do they mean by that? Is it a gender? Is it a sexual identity for them? And maybe offering those options in both measures of sexuality and gender to catch all of that data. Since many Indigenous languages are verb-based, we might consider using verb-based language in surveys, such as, are you a person who combines more than one gender, rather than identity-based language, such as, are you Two-Spirit? This could get away from the problem of our terms going out of use so quickly. So sometimes sexual identity terms will shift very quickly in a matter of years. A term that was quite current and used will suddenly no longer be used, and new terms emerge all the time. In health research, ask if people have status, because this does determine their access to a range of service and also to stressors affecting health. But also maybe consider asking, when did people obtain status? So someone who lived their whole life with status might have different health outcomes than someone who obtained it in 1985 under Bill C-31 or in 2010 under Bill C-3. We need to ask about territory and if participants live in their territory. This is essential to contextualize data. So we need to know things like, has their community had a boil water advisory for 40+ years? Has the community been involved in a land claim? Do they control their own social services? These are elements that have been closely linked with Indigenous health in the literature, but we rarely ever ask about them or connect up the territory from which people come to do that homework. Knowing about the context from which participants come help us understand the factors that affect their health. I think we need to analyze Two-Spirit participants separately from those reporting identities like gay, lesbian, bi, queer, and also separately from people reporting identities like transgender, queer, or non-binary. We could include people who carry other Indigenous identities in the Two-Spirit category, such as indigiqueer, or we might also consider whether we want to include people who use and carry an Indigenous term, like a gokwe or a gokwe nini. Measures that ask participants to assess their health on a poor to excellent range may not work very well for Indigenous participants, because many of us come from gratitude-focused cultures. And so what you'll see in the data outcomes are usually many people report good health, even if they're struggling with multiple conditions. And so that good health doesn't really tell us much, except perhaps the person's outlook that it could be worse. To decolonize research, we need to think about how colonial perspectives shape whose data we collect and how we organize and analyze that data. Finally, expect everything to change. Indigenous nations are not frozen in time. Be open to having the context change over the course of your research career and sometimes over the course of one research project. I'll stop there and say Walaliak to you for all of your time and patience. I welcome your thoughts, questions, and ideas. And I know that some of you had emailed with some inquiries that haven't been covered by this. So feel free to bring those questions up.
Great. So if you have any questions for a presenter, please type them in the chat panel. You can access it by clicking the chat icon that's available somewhere on your screen, hopefully. You can also use the raise your hand feature if you'd like to speak instead. And Margaret, I want to say thank you so much for this amazing presentation. Thank you to CAAL-CBPA for hosting as well. This week is actually Love Data Week, and this year's theme is My Kind of Data, and I could not think of a presentation that would be a better fit for this theme.
Oh, well, it's a great conversation to have about how do we collect and how do we protect and preserve our data. It's important to have those conversations with the groups.
So I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I'm just going to start running through some of the previously sent questions, but people,
Sure.
if you have things, just put them in there. So I kind of think I know your answer on this one, but someone was wondering, should we distinguish between Two-Spirit and transgender people, or is it okay to group them together?
I think it depends on what we're doing. So if we're looking to get a sense of health outcomes for people who are of any sort of sexual or gender difference, then perhaps we're grouping everyone together and comparing them to people who are cis hetero. And that's sort of a typical way that we might organize data, is that everyone who is othered sexually or gender-wise goes in one category, and everyone who is not othered goes in the other category. However, if we're trying to get a little more in depth to look at how Two-Spirit as an identity shapes health, then asking, including people who identify as trans in that category would not be as useful. And so we might think about, like, what is it we're trying to measure and who needs to be in that category for that measurement to make sense? And so if what we're trying to measure is that intersection between gender difference and indigeneity, then perhaps trans and indigeneity is an intersection we want to look at, but maybe we're going to look at it separately from Two-Spirit and Indigenous identity. And because, you know, the way people use and choose identities is significant. Sometimes people have multiple identities, and we rarely ask, like, choose all that apply for your sexual identities. We usually assume that one of those, the one we're most familiar with often, is the primary identity, and that the ones we're less familiar with are less important. But that's not a given, I don't think, at all. And so whether we include trans under it, I think it's a developing question. I would say I see them as separate, but it depends on what you're going to measure. Good question, though.
Very good answer. Next question I have, I'm almost wondering if I can't see the chat after all, so hopefully Cynthia can chime in if there's questions in there, because I have nothing, but I'll just keep going with their previously submitted questions. Someone was curious about measures that could be taken to encourage Indigenous people to self-identify, such as on university applications.
Ooh, good question. So there, I think we need to ask, are you Indigenous, and explain what it means. And then if they're looking to collect colonial categorizing information, like are you First Nations, then certainly ask those as sub-questions. We might get at asking questions without using identifiers, like did any of your ancestors live in the area now known as Canada prior to, and then put in the dates where we would consider settlers to have firmly established themselves. So I think there are other ways that we could get at it, but it's becoming increasingly challenging to just go with asking what used to be seen as a simple question of like, are you Indigenous? Many people for whom English is not their first language will not necessarily know what this question is asking. They may identify as Indigenous in their own country if they were colonized there, but the Canadian government, for the purposes of funding, may not consider them Indigenous in Canada. And so this is an issue that we sometimes run into with hiring. But in terms of scholarship for students, I think asking multiple questions that we can then combine on our end to determine whether we would consider this person eligible for the scholarship might be a better way to go. So, asking questions about their communities of origin, about who their ancestors were, and then combining some of those. But I think it's not a decision that universities should be making by themselves. They should be making those decisions in partnership with the communities that most of those students are going to be coming from. So for instance, in Mi'kma'ki, I'd really like to see more engagement with Mi'kmaq communities to determine what kind of questions they would like their future university-going children to be answering on those kind of surveys.
I like that. I know for myself, I'm not very consistent in how I identify or when I identify. I almost feel like I need a 2-minute speech to clearly identify correctly in the right way.
Yeah, and it's difficult because we often flag, like, if someone changes their story, that's like a big red flag, right? But sometimes people will change how they express their history depending on who's asking. And yes. So, like, if I'm telling a Mi'kmaq person who I am, it's going to sound different than if I'm telling a settler who I am. And so, like, I think the context matters.
Yeah, I've also found that organization asking the question for me has an impact. Like, I'll pick universities one way, but then anything hospital system related, there's some very not nice stories about people who are being recognized as Indigenous in hospital settings, and I don't usually self-identify ever.
Yeah, I remember my mother writing on a form when I was in the hospital as a child under race. She wrote human, and at the time I thought, oh, she's being political again. But I just didn't realize at the time like what it could mean for an Indigenous child to be in a hospital system.
Yeah. Great questions coming in from the chat now, and I'm going to apologize. I'm going to do some reading, some paraphrasing. Someone has pointed out that if we follow the recommendation of separating out data for categories like Two-Spirit, Indigenous, transgender, queer, the numbers might get really small the more granular we get. So how do we kind of balance the risk of getting unusable data because anonymization becomes impossible with being distinct in the different ways of being in our identity?
Yeah, and this is where it's a challenge that we don't recruit enough people for these surveys. That if we're trying to do a study looking at Two-Spirit people, we almost never have enough data to do any kind of even the most basic analyses apart from running a frequency or a comparison. And so we almost know nothing about Two-Spirit health outcomes as a result, because the kinds of analyses we can do are so simplistic. And so we need to figure out how can we do better analyses, either with more people or using the data that we currently have. Are there new techniques we could use that would give us better answers. This is something that a quantitative specialist, and ideally many quantitative specialists, should look at. But I think some of the issues about recruitment, I've seen it with other populations. So it used to be we had almost no bisexual people in any survey that was done about sexuality. And so we couldn't say anything about bisexual health, and that has changed. And so I think it could change for Two-Spirit identity as well. The problem is there, our groups are small, and then it's a smaller group within our small group. As for the anonymizing issue, we may need to think about what we do with our data differently, that because it's on a smaller scale, we might not be able to do some of the kind of anonymizing things that are done with big data. So we may need to think more about not necessarily anonymous data, but confidential data. And again, that's something I think quantitative experts could advise us on.
Next, I have a comment that, again, I apologize, I'm going to paraphrase and have
Sure.
to read. Someone who said that it was a really amazing presentation, which I agree with. And it got them thinking a lot about issues around research data management and linked data in libraries, and how development in those areas kind of increased the pressure to normalize terms and variables and teams between data sets, but in ways that don't necessarily serve Indigenous data peoples and research well. So a comment there, but do you want to respond to it?
Yeah, and that's where we have to figure, like, who is the data for? And I think maybe having computer programs that offer variations. So, you know, sometimes if I go to websites, it'll give me an option to translate this into English. It might not always be accurate, but there could be options to change the data depending on who's using it and what they're trying to do with it. And so I think we could come up with ways so that the same data set could serve multiple users. But I think there's a lot of pressure to just adopt the settler terms, because that would be easiest. And so it, like, again and again, it means Indigenous communities and their interests are not being served. And so there may be situations where we just want to prioritize Indigenous terminology to get the research done. So for instance, in the Toronto Aboriginal Research Project, the TARP that Janet Smiley did, her and her team worked really hard to ask Indigenous community relevant questions, because they are members of Indigenous communities themselves. And so those kind of data projects, I think, produce really useful data, because they thought so much about it going in that you don't have to work trying to contextualize data that has a confusing source or used weird terminology. They just did it right from the get-go in many cases. And so I think we could take a lot of learning from some of those situations. I think StatsCan and other groups are trying to do it better. I know, like, a lot of Indigenous scholars who work in health, I got emails from Statistics Canada asking to, you know, tell us what you think of this, or tell us what you think of that, or showing us drafts of various things that they were considering bringing forward. And so I think that's a good practice, and I'd like to see more of that.
I was struck by how long Statistics Canada stuck to Aboriginal as a term, saying it's the official terminology from the Indian Act. Sorry, guys, until finally they changed it to Indigenous. And it's so much nicer to look at now, I find. Another question from the chat. So do you have hope about Indigenous consultation for the census moving forward? Is the consultation process useful?
I think so, especially because it's so relied upon for policymaking. In many cases, people who make policy are not going to look to a community-based Indigenous research project to get their data. They want to see that Statistics Canada logo. And so I think encouraging them and teaching them in some cases how to improve their data and how to engage with Indigenous communities better is a good thing. However, we mustn't forget that the reason they're doing it is so that they can manage and reduce their fiduciary responsibilities. Like, it's really about managing how much money they owe us and making sure there are constantly fewer Indigenous people to whom they have that responsibility. And so we can't forget that although they might be great at data management, they're not necessarily in committed to an Indigenous future for our communities. And so it can be useful data, but it's not necessarily free of that colonial intent. And so I think we need to be aware of that when we're using that data.
Which kind of works really nicely with the person's follow-up question, which is, should we be looking outside of this colonial collection method entirely, or is there a way that the census could capture indigeneity accurately with true self-determination?
Yeah, I'd love to see a large national group organize large national studies of Indigenous peoples. So I think Native Women's Association of Canada would be a great choice. I think AFN might have some motives for having that kind of data. And I think there's a need for it. So we see this sometimes in Indigenous health, where Indigenous organizations launch health surveys and maintain those, or work in collaboration with settler government agencies to do so. And I think it's important to have that work led and directed by Indigenous people, because otherwise we get weird questions in the survey that we can't end up using for anything.
Thank you. Another great question. Do other countries collect Indigenous data as well?
They do, yes. So these same problems can crop up in Australia, in New Zealand, in really any place where there's been colonialism. Lots of populations might have the exact same data issues that we do. Yeah, really good question.
Yeah. I'm running out of chat questions, but I have like a few pre-submitted questions to run through. So let's see.
Sure.
This one.
Sorry,
go ahead. Okay, smudging and use of sacred medicines by AFEB to spirit or transgender individuals during menstruation. Someone ran into that question on their campus and haven't been able to find an answer anywhere. They're waiting on some answers, possibly from elders, but if you have a tip for them.
Ooh, interesting. So this varies by culture. So what menstruation might mean in a Mi'kmaq context might be different from what it might mean in contexts for other nations. But what I've encountered is that menstruating people in Mi'kmaq tradition are seen as already very powerful and kind of, in some cases, a type of medicine themselves. And so the question about can they do this, can they do that? When we bring in the settler assumption, which assumes that guides against doing things while menstruating are rooted in sexism, then we may miss or misinterpret cultural practices in an Indigenous context. And so some of those concerns about, like, why can't I do this if I'm menstruating, can be related to, is this an issue of sexism? And Indigenous women have sometimes said, I think this particular issue where you say I can't do this in our tradition is just a bunch of sexism. And then other places, Indigenous women have said, well, let me try to understand this differently, or do understand it differently, as unrelated to sexism. And so I think it differs depending on where you are. I have noticed a change over time in how people view this. And so I notice younger people tend to be a little more on the line of, it shouldn't matter. Come on in and join us and touch our medicines, or smudge if you've got bad cramps, kind of a thing. Whereas people who are of a older generation may have different viewpoints on it. And so I think there's a lot of things shaping how menstruating people interact with sacred medicines, or expected to. And in the case of trans people, that can often be issues of transphobia shaping some of that. And so it depends on the elder you get. It depends on the traditions they've received. But like many things, particularly say issues around whether people can engage with medicines if they've been using alcohol or drugs, practice has changed over time. So like traditionally you would not engage with, say, a sweat or with medicines if you had been drinking, but people for whom alcohol addiction is an issue, sometimes elders have prioritized getting that elder support and help over any of those other traditions. And so it can really sometimes come down to who is the elder who is engaging with you on it. Good question, though, because like it's access to ceremony and access to cultural supports and spiritual supports make a huge difference for Indigenous people's health and well-being. So whether they can access those things or not is really important.
That pretty much completes the pre-submitted questions. You've addressed all of the rest of them already in some way in your talk. You're getting lots and lots of really nice feedback in the chat, but I'm not seeing any more questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plop in the link to the Love Data Week research guide for more exciting Love Data Week online events. And I'm giving it a few more seconds for more questions.
Your question wasn't data related. That's totally fine. Yeah, it's interesting because like the medicines issue, like I work at Dalhousie campus, and the question of where can we smudge, they've often treated it a sort of akin to like where can I smoke, like so we don't always have a framework in settler cultures for understanding smudging and other ceremonial activities, and I don't think it's appropriate to put it in the same category as smoking. There actually, to my knowledge, hasn't been any data to confirm whether people with environmental sensitivities are also sensitive to sweetgrass or sage. I'd love to see that data. I'd love to see that research done. But as with many things, the issues that are most significant for Indigenous communities are often not funded and under-researched as a result.
So I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm going to say one last thank you to CAAL-CBPA for hosting. A huge thank you, Margaret, for presenting. This was really wonderful.
Oh, well, laliak to everybody. Thank you for coming out for this.
You're getting some applause reactions there.